Thank you so much, Paco. It's an honor to be the Max Abramovitz lecturer. It's an honor to kick off this amazing lecture series at an amazing school. I think you guys should all just I hope you feel that as much as I do, that you couldn't have a better director right now. Paco is going to, I think, do great things. And I hope that my talk will help you expand your thinking about the opportunities ahead. 2020 sucked. We all know that. We're hoping, but I'm actually quite an optimist. And you'll probably see that when you kind of listen to this lecture, because I really do believe we can make really crappy stuff quite beautiful and really help communities. So I'm going to share my screen and show. All right, share. Okay. Full screen. Okay. So most architecture, planning, landscape architecture schools really ignore suburbia, but it's not exactly a newsflash. Suburbia is where most Americans live. It's where most development is happening, including globally. And as the people, as well as the malls, the strip malls, the office parks and subdivisions that we built last century, as they are aging, it's providing you with a really tremendous opportunity to retrofit suburbia. So as Paco said, I maintain the world's only database that no one else bothers, that tracks what I deem to be successful examples of dying suburban properties that are being retrofitted one way or another into more sustainable, more just, and more prosperous places. When June Williamson and I wrote our first book, we had about 80 case studies. And as Paco said, I now have over 2,000 in the database. And the numbers actually have been surging since the pandemic started. But what's really kind of changed, even more than just the number of retrofits since the first book, is that the retrofits themselves have been getting more and more ambitious, tackling more and more challenges. So this is why we chose to really organize this new book into two parts. The first part identifies what we are calling kind of, and we only had room and word count to do 6. We could have picked more, but anyway, what we saw as the top 6 urgent challenges that the mid-20th century suburbs were never designed for. And so these are the challenges are reduced auto dependency. We need to improve public health, support an aging population, leverage social capital for equity, compete for jobs, and add water and energy resilience. Obviously, climate change, equity, health, these are all really, really big challenges. And yet nobody was talking about them when the suburbia was kind of formed as a pattern of development. So what's interesting though is that it's as the shopping malls, the office parks, and other suburban property types are aging and becoming increasingly underperforming, whether they're getting knocked out by the internet, whether various market preferences, changing demographics are actually quite huge in the suburbs, it gives us this opportunity to either redevelop, re-inhabit, or re-green these properties. Those are kind of the 3 main strategies, and I'll talk, in my opinion, the projects that actually do a little of all 3, there's some degree of redevelopment to make them much more compact, walkable, more sustainable in various ways, but also some degree of re-inhabiting some of those existing boxes, better connecting us to the past, but also some regreening to connect us to nature. So those are sort of what's happening with the first part of the book. Then the bulk of the book are 32 case studies. And we sort of created we wanted to get a cross section somewhat across the country. We have one in Canada. We wanted to get diverse market conditions. What you're able to do, if the reason the mall died is because all of the middle class jobs have fled because the steel mill closed or whatever, something like, there isn't really you probably aren't going to redevelop in places like that with higher density walkable urbanism. And sometimes then the reinhabitation with more socially sustainable uses, more community serving uses, makes a ton more sense. And I wish we had more regreening examples. I just think we need tons of them in the face of climate change, and there aren't enough of them, but I'll show a few. So we're really, I'm not going to show you all 32 case studies. It might feel like it, but I'm not. But they're also, we chose projects that are raising the bar on meeting usually not just one, but multiple of these challenges. I'm going to show them in relation to kind of the one challenge that they're an especially good example of. But I'll mention kind of all of this starts to merge together pretty quickly. So job one really is still disrupt auto dependence. And there's so many reasons. I mean, there's the environmental health, public health and safety, economic health, all converge as cascading effects from our dependence on the automobile. I mean, do most of you realize you are spending $25 a day on average to simply have one car, let alone if you have two of those or more? So the strategies to reduce auto dependency are on the right in blue, and there's we go through sort of a whole bunch of these. I'm not going to go really through all of them, but obviously it's to try to introduce a mix of uses in a more walkable pattern, so people don't have to use the car so much. Multimodal systems and transit. I am going to show some road diets and the insertion of new street networks overlaid onto the more suburban patterns. And I'll talk also about the importance of design. If the market isn't there for full-on urbanism, and you have to put in some parking lots, design them as future building sites. It's such an easy thing to do, but just imagine, think ahead, and it can make an enormous difference. So one of the first things I do want to just clarify, when we talk about retrofitting suburbia, we are really focused on suburban form versus urban form. There's endless academic discussions trying to define exactly what is a suburb. There are so many now new names: surban, urburb, technoburb, ethnoburb, metroburb, all these different efforts to try to define these changes that are happening in the suburbs. June and I kind of said, stay out of that fray. And we just focus, we're both trained as architects, so we focus on the form. If it is a box that fronts a sidewalk, and if it has parking, the parking is either underneath or behind, that's urban form. If it's a box surrounded by quite a bit of open space that is either lawn or asphalt, that's suburban form. Similarly, with the road networks, if it's more or less something kind of grid-like and interconnected with walkable sized blocks, that's urban form. If it's tree-like, and so you sort of like a highway is the trunk, the arterials are the branches, and the twigs are all the cul-de-sacs, that's suburban form. So with that simple definition, let me start off with, this is one of my favorite road diet projects. So this is Lancaster, California. It is almost 2 hours east of Los Angeles. And their main street had been losing shops to the mall next door, in the next door community, for decades. They had tried widening the street. They added a turn lane, so they were up to 5 lanes. That just made it even faster to zip through town and pass the shops. Then they did the opposite. So they put their main street on a road diet. They went down from the 5 lanes to 2, put the parking in the middle, in between street trees and street lights. And they reduced the speed from 45 to 20. On the one hand, there's a saying, if a pedestrian is hit by a car, 20 is plenty. If a pedestrian is hit by a car going about 22 miles an hour, chances are you live. If they're in an SUV, if it's an SUV going 23, you're probably dead. If you're trying to make a place walkable and lively and vibrant, full of all these people, you got to slow the cars down. So, but it's actually an advantage. So even though you'd think it would be a disaster, you're reducing the lanes, you're reducing the speed. But in fact, when cars are going 45 miles an hour, they have to be pretty far apart from each other. When they're going 20 miles an hour, they can be almost bumper to bumper. You can get just as much throughput. It just takes a few seconds longer. And at that speed, people can kind of turn their head and see the shop windows. Oh, there's a sale at so-and-so. Pull into the parking. And it's worked really quite magnificently. Already 2 years just after the revitalization, they were already seeing new businesses coming down, reduction in traffic collisions. They invested in quite a lot of new affordable housing. This is a very working class, very Republican, very conservative town. It is of note, the entry in TripAdvisor, their #1 attraction before the boulevard was that they have a part of the highway where somebody dug grooves into the road, and if you go over it at exactly 55 miles an hour, it plays the William Tell Overture. That was the big fun thing to do in Lancaster. And I admit it'd be fun once. But now the boulevard has become this. I went out and visited, I took some of these photos. It has now become a place. It has become a destination. I talked to one shop owner who said, oh, the mall keeps calling me. They want me to come back. No, I'd much rather be here. It's a local vibe. And so even though the parking, most of the time, that parking in the middle is used as parking, and it's actually got a lighter permeable paving. It's reducing urban heat islands significantly, both by the color, but also with all the trees. But when they're having their farmers markets, when they're having Halloween, festivals, they have a big Halloween boulevard. It becomes this fantastic pedestrian place. And Liz Mull, the architect and lead designer, you kind of look at it. I know a lot of architects kind of look at this and say, well, this is the work of civil engineers, right? What are architects doing getting involved in the design of streets? Well, it's the engineers who kind of designed the first one. They were only thinking about the throughput and the speed. It's the architects who are actually thinking about the place and the space and working with landscape architects and some great planners as well. So Liz Mull was the lead designer on this project, an architect with Mull and Palazoides. And she said, when they went and visited, and you can see the before photo, she said, it really took a lot of imagination to try to imagine, but they said, we tried to think of what was the most pedestrian-filled sequence of spaces that we loved. And we thought of Las Ramblas in Barcelona. So we said, we're gonna make a Rambla. And it goes for 9 blocks. They also took out 8 traffic lights. That was a pretty big deal. But it's really been an extremely successful project and really shows, I think, the value of imagining and bringing design imagination to spaces like this. So this is an example in a working class neighborhood, relatively low income. There's a whole other story. Because the success of this project gave the mayor enough political clout to then claim that he was the first community in the country to require every house to be solar. even as a total Republican, he just said, we need to do this. We're in the desert. we have so much solar and we're poor and we need, so a lot of really cool things have come out of this project. But this is an example of really a fairly modest. It wasn't expensive. They didn't change curb and gutter. So that kept, it really was not an expensive project. Next project is what you can happen in a hot market. This is the Pike District, about 30-minute car ride or a metro rail ride outside of Washington, D.C. in North Bethesda. And this is just the first piece of a larger proposal. But so this first chunk is 400 acres centered around an existing rail subway station and along Rockville Pike. Rockville Pike is an 8-lane highway, and the properties along it are mostly strip malls. There's some taller buildings, but it's really, it's sprawl. So at a certain point, the county contacted the 6 major property owners in this 400 acres of this all being the commercial parts. Let's say a couple there are apartment buildings in there right now. But said, we want to do a new sector plan for this area. And the developers actually said, let us have a stab at it first. Because each of these developers owned property elsewhere in the DC market and knew that walkable urbanism doubled their rents, commercial and residential and retail. So they hired a very good planning firm who came up with this plan on the left. Every one of those dotted streets is a new street that's being built, a new public street being built on the developer's private land, and the developers are paying an additional 10% property tax assessment to help pay for it. And they're doing that because they're being allowed now, they get their properties rezoned to allow a mix of uses, much higher density, up to 30 stories. So here's the first, on the right is the first chunk. This is all being managed very carefully. You cannot build until those streets are put in. So the first piece has been done by Federal Realty, took this 30-acre strip mall, upper right, and this is that's sort of what it looked like 2012, and here's what it looked like in 2019. So quite it's really cut a lot of new, that's this piece on the plan there. So very walkable blocks. They're waiting to now just put in the office once the county puts Rockville Pike on a road diet and puts bus rapid transit down the middle. So that's all happening next. So White Flint, which I just showed, is this 400-acre piece. They're doing this for 4 miles. And they're just getting the developers to pay for putting in the walkable streets. And the development that is happening is, I think, really being done with tremendous care, very walkable, fine-grained, a lot of attention to detail, very active ground floors, high touch, high texture, lots of places to sit, lots of green infrastructure to cool things down. I mean, we're operating both at the scale of, fine-grained placemaking and at a regional scale, transferring trips from the highway to the rail system. So a pretty remarkable transformation, and one to kind of continue to watch. More typical is when it's a single property, like a dead mall. So this is one of the projects that we profiled in the first book. Belmar was a 100-acre super regional 1.3 million square foot mall. Here it is at its heyday, probably Black Friday. And today it is 22 walkable blocks with public streets, and it's 3 times the density. It's generating more than 4 times the tax revenue, And it's a mixed use, really feels kind of like it's the downtown that Lakewood never had. So building in this case, they were able to connect quite a lot of the streets with neighboring streets. And they've got they hope to be able eventually to connect in the places where that's not currently allowed. But this kind of transformation, there's now over 70 dead malls have become mixed-use town centers like this, another 56 in process, and another 50 that have just been announced fairly recently. So lots of these going on. Again, not every community can really support it, but we're really seeing dramatic changes, and in many cases, it's this kind of introduction of walkable urbanism. But if we could just do one thing in our neighborhoods, it would be to build more sidewalks and more bike lanes. This is a graphic we produced for the book. I mean, it just sort of kills me that 46% of trips are, and that's from a typical suburban house, are less than 3 miles, 3 miles or less. That's that's a very reasonable bike ride. 35% are 2 miles, could easily be a scooter ride. 21%, hey, could be a nice 20-minute walk for a mile. So but the sad reality is we've built an environment that simply, it doesn't make it safe or comfortable to ride a bike or walk in the streets. And so instead we just try to block any kind of cut through traffic and keep we end up with underused residential neighborhood streets and overcrowded arterial roads, and it's not working very well. So, and some of that gets to why we have a pretty enormous public health problem in the US. Sadly, suburban sprawl and human sprawl correlate. The more sedentary lifestyles of living where you're not walking, you're not very physically active, where you're driving everywhere, or you're sitting at the office or sitting on the couch, leads to very high rates. Obesity is at epidemic levels. That leads to diabetes, heart disease, and the complications of asthma, all of which are often the highest, disproportionately high in low-income people of color, and then exacerbate the vulnerability to COVID-19. So we have so many reasons, of course, that we need to improve public health. And so we've broken some of those solutions in terms of sort of the architects are well familiar with health, safety, and welfare. So a lot of this is encouraging people to be more physically active, improve the access to health care, improve air, water quality and soil quality, keep people safe from accidents, from exposure to toxins, and more importantly, lately, really a lot more attention to reducing the stresses of income inequality, increasing mental health, reduce the loneliness epidemic and social isolation. So as I said, on the one hand, there's a whole lot of, whether it's malls, whether it's strip malls, big box, that are being converted into healthcare. And we see I'm just showing 2, but we see a whole lot of these. And a lot of these former retail spaces, they're often perfectly convertible to whether it's medical or educational uses, libraries. We see number one reuse is actually as office space, and workspace is a great give people jobs instead of taking their money. That sounds like a good deal to me. This one's a very interesting story, I think, especially in terms of health care. So this is Somerville, Massachusetts, is right across the Charles River from Boston. It's actually a very dense place, but it is residents. It is a suburb in has always sort of conceived of itself as more of a suburb. But it had this on its riverfront. It had this, which was formerly industrial. The industrial buildings were then converted, this long one, into a mall, and then a strip mall and a Home Depot and a bunch of other things. And in 2000, an IKEA was going to move in onto this piece. And the city zoned it, said, fine, great, nothing happening there, go ahead. And a local group of citizens actually sued the city and said, zoning is supposed to be according to highest and best use. You're zoning riverfront property along a transit line for yet another auto-dependent use in an area that right now has amongst the highest asthma rates in the country because of this major highway that goes right into Boston, spewing lots of toxins. They didn't actually win the lawsuit, but they held up development long enough that IKEA backed out. Another developer, Federal Realty, came in, and they and the Boston Metro line that used to always ran right along that bridge, but it never stopped there. They opened a station. So Federal Realty has now produced walkable urbanism, really quite dense, and the lawsuit was actually really did help to it was a YIMBY. We don't want auto-dependent uses. We want transit, and we want 30 million in tax revenue. We want 30 acres of parkland along the riverfront, and we want what was the other? The 30,000 jobs. And it's really, the project is really delivering pretty amazingly. And it was just a result of a number of, I was on the first charrette. I lived in Somerville in 2000, but it's really quite remarkable. And the health concerns, so now the highway is still there, but no residential is allowed to be near the highway. They can put in office with super HEPA filters, but no residential. The mayor, who finally kind of made all this happen, grew up with asthma as a child, and he absolutely became a champion for this project, that kind of thing. The importance of mayors is really important in this stuff. So this project does a number of things that I admire. And in particular, what I think is really quite amazing, I got a chance to meet with the firm that was doing this. Edens are the largest owner of grocery anchored strip malls. And a woman had worked her way up to become CEO. She worked her way with the company. And when she became CEO, she said, the writing may be on the wall about strip malls. I want to try this mixed use town center thing. This is going to be our beta, trial project. So they went and visited a whole bunch of them and said, we're going to do a better one. And it's pretty remarkable kind of what they did. What she also, so on the one hand, part of what they did was every building at the ground floor has really fine-grained little shops and restaurants and very walkable. Every 25 feet, you kind of turn your head. That's the grain. It works beautifully. Above that, 2 levels of parking, and above that, a Target department store, discount department store. She knew she had to be able to get the financials to work. She had to have big floor plate stuff, but she said it's just like putting the milk at the back of the grocery store. We're going to give people the destination stuff at the ground floor, but also the affordable stuff, and the workplace and the cinema, big cinemas. What she also was very concerned with about, she listened when the former Surgeon General under Biden, he will be the new Surgeon General again, Vivek Murthy, announced that the US was in a loneliness epidemic. And I had the privilege of interviewing her at length, and I was really impressed with how the efforts that she took in this project to really try to encourage community building, try to help folks, give them an excuse to get out of their house, come and be part of a community. So they put in a little town green. Lots of projects do that. It's a little AstroTurf, 1 acre. It's above a whole lot of stormwater stuff. But the particularly key thing was, this used to be a site. This was originally, it was a drive-in movie theater starting in the 50s. It became a cinemaplex in the 80s. Somebody got murdered, nobody went, the cinemaplex died, and that's when Edens bought the property. Then, but they brought in an Angelica Film Center to be the new anchor, and they put, at the last minute, they decided to put a big 23-foot LED screen on the side of the cinema facing the town green. And now that lets them program the yoga classes in the morning, program mom and toddler activities in midday. All the moms are all driving in generally for this and desperate to have a gathering space in the burbs. This is great. They play all the local sports teams, games. They project in the afternoon and evening. They are constantly activating that space, really quite economically. They're also, though, paying great attention to, at the ground floor, on the wide sidewalks, always having a lot of seating, a lot of shade, and whether it's beautiful wood benches across from Anthropology, or it's the big plastic lawn chairs in front of Target, but just everything she can do to try to really engage visitors. And it's really pretty well designed. I like this one. Oops, not advancing. Hello. My slides are stuck. Oh man. Why is that? Okay, no, it went back. Oh, come on. Sorry about this. Okay, so the next challenge, support an aging population, obviously related to the health issues, but I think especially important in the suburbs. We think of the suburbs as family focused. No, since 2000, more than 2/3 of households in the suburbs have not had children in them. You have a whole lot of empty nesters who loved their single family house while they were raising their kids, but the kids have long since fledged. They're now starting to retire, and it's actually getting kind of lonely. So we have particularly in the suburbs, which are so auto-dependent, that aging population is increasingly at risk of being quite stranded. So a lot of different things that are pretty important, really important, I think, to think about in terms of how to help support them. And one in particular is really integrating senior housing into complete neighborhoods and not into walkable neighborhoods, so that they're not so isolated. Oh no, this is happening again. Why? Let me try this way. Okay, that's doing it. So this is an example of that. This is in Wayzata, Minnesota, which is a relatively affluent town right on a beautiful lake. It's a bit of a kind of resort area. And in the 60s, a mall, not a very big one, but still, a mall was built right on top of a wetland. Shouldn't have happened. It's been dumping runoff, polluting the lake, the town's main asset, for decades. But finally, when the mall died, they demolished it, and they've now replaced it with a mixed-use community, but that is primarily anchored by senior housing. So there's a grocery store, there's a number of shops, there's a hotel, and then there's a big green where they put on activities. Again, the importance of these programmed parks, not very big parks. People in the suburbs don't really need access to leafy green. They need access to people. And that's the real role that these play. And this project also, because of they were really a very high water table. Everything was pile driven. They also drove down geothermal while they were doing that, so that they're heating the sidewalks in the winter, and so the seniors don't slip and fall. There a lot of attention to stormwater. There will be zero runoff ever again from this site. All right, let me forward that way. So that was a rather affluent example. Also in Minnesota, not so far away from that one, but a much more affordable example is here on the left, is a former Days Inn motel turned into affordable senior housing. It happens to be an out parcel of a mall, and that gives the seniors easy walking distance to a whole lot of shopping and services that they can get. That mall actually is featured in our book also for a lot of green infrastructure that they've been putting in. Another example of, again, just re-inhabiting, often for those more affordable examples, it's really re-inhabit some existing building is generally going to be more affordable than building new. So on the right here is a former just suburban office building converted into the Eastern Village co-housing. It put up the balconies, made the parking court into a real courtyard, and it is mostly seniors, and really, I think, very nicely done. So all of this also layers in with leveraging social capital for equity. It's, again, the suburbs have so emphasized the private life, the space inside the home, what's mine, not the places that are ours. And it's resulted in on the one hand, it's made, and there's the whole racist history of the red zoning not allowing, the covenants that would not allow people of color or single women to move into the suburbs. So we've ended up with, today, the suburbs are much more socially diverse, but they're still not actually living together. There will be white wealthy suburbs, there will be a few black wealthy suburbs, but and then there's a lot of a variety. But in general, the suburbs are actually incredibly segregated from each other. And the poverty in the suburbs, is really, it's kind of invisible. It's not concentrated, so one doesn't tend to see it as much. But there are actually, since 2005, more Americans in poverty have been living in suburbs than living in cities. So there's a tremendous need for more social infrastructure. And again, that's often going to be through re-inhabiting some of, especially former retail spaces, with education and job training, childcare, local jobs, healthy food, all those good things. Certainly, as I showed with the Mosaic project, the importance of those little programmed parks, places that start to really try to bring people together and help build community, and help people form connections that are not just within their own demographic or within, so, and then still there is absolutely need to be able to expand affordability when we are redeveloping areas, and whether that's through inclusionary zoning, allowing missing middle housing, real estate transaction fees, which I think are a really great underused tool. And really importantly, there's not a lot of direct gentrification in the suburbs. I mean, most of this is happening on commercial sites, but there are a fair number of older garden apartment complexes that are cheap housing now. They're getting demolished, and then what's coming in to replace them is at 3 times the cost. So a few places will require 100% replacement units and sort of say, okay, if you're going to want to tear this one down and replace it with something denser, you have to really, you're going to still have to offer replacement units to the people you're displacing, but not enough communities require that. So one of my heroes, who's really working with these garden apartments, is Margie Stagmeyer. She has been a real estate investor all of her career. She's written a book on real estate investing, and she's focused mostly on multifamily apartments. She's here in Atlanta, and early in her career, she noticed that, most of her tenants were single moms working $10 an hour jobs down at the airport. And if one of the kids got sick and mom missed a shift, she lost her job and couldn't pay rent. And what happens is then there's just this revolving door, extremely high transiency of the moms and the kids having to move kind of from apartment complex to apartment complex. And the kids are losing on average 3 months of school every time that happens. So as that cycle is happening, what she beginning to find was that the worst performing elementary schools were also wherever these really large, aging garden apartment complexes were. So she made one change. She partnered with the elementary school and turned one unit into an after-school program. And the ripple effects have just been astonishing. She is not only now the kids get to know each other, the parents get to know each other through the kids. They're covering for each other. Nobody's missing a shift at work. Nobody's losing their job. Everything is sort of stabilizing instead of always having kind of a constant number of vacancies. She's her places are full, and she's now preaching to other folks, don't raise the rent. Just keep these places. We need these affordable units. These are actually, they're not lovely places by design. Any designer is going to think. A lot of times they have mold issues. They're not healthy places, but these are the housing of last resort, and they're aging out, and we need them to be preserved desperately. And so Margie now has started a nonprofit that she targets the worst performing elementary schools, buys the garden apartments, and then now is offering healthcare, putting in community gardens. And she's had sort of a few people actually graduate to then be able to get a down payment to buy a house. And so a lot of really, really great results from a simple one little after school program going into a unit. A more equally economically distressed community, but a much more ambitious project is this one. Wyandanch on Long Island is the most economically distressed community in Long Island. It is a historically Black community. It's more or less neighbors with Levittown, and Levittown had restrictions, would not allow people of color. And Wyandanch was the one place where they could settle. And yet it didn't have any sewers. It didn't have a lot of things. But the one thing it had was a train station on the Long Island Railroad, although it had the only station that had not been renovated and updated. The story of how this retrofit came about is really quite a remarkable story of both nonprofit leadership, elected officials leadership, and just some really smart policies of engaging the community. There was so much distrust in this community that anything good could really happen for them, that anything that anybody was going to propose, they were afraid they were going to get screwed. And but what has resulted at this point now is a brand new train station, a brand new town. It's a green in the summer. It's an ice skating rink in the winter when my husband got to go out and photograph it. By building new development, they were actually able to finally bring in sewers, and they had requirements that it be local labor building all of this. So the little news story there on the lower left. So a lot of really great connections between, it's really connecting affordable housing to the affordable transportation that then provides better job access, both along the train route, but also in terms of the actual building. And this is just the first phase of a larger redevelopment in Wyandanch. And of course, that training is a really important piece of trying to help folks, whether they're low income, middle income, but for everyone, the role of education is obviously really important in terms of social equity. So this one is a pretty interesting story. This is in Austin, Texas, and the mall had died. So the local community college actually had read our first book, in which we told the story of a community college that had taken up space at a mall. And they said, whoa, let's try it. So their first step was they bought the old J.C. Penney's. Here's the before on the left of J.C. Penney's as this brutalist, concrete, not exactly welcoming box. Only an architect could love kind of an elevation. And then below that, the before interior of the mall. Then the community college put a porch on the front of it, put in cisterns to capture the roof, a lot of green infrastructure, brightened up the interior, and they turned the J.C. Penney, which is the floor plate was the equivalent of 6 football fields. They turned it into a math lab. And it's a remarkable way of teaching. Math is the #1 subject that a lot of people fail. And they've actually cut attrition 50%. That has begun to attract digital employers. Austin is a very hot market. And the Metro decided to open a new transit stop. So given all that success, the community college said, we're buying the whole mall. And so now they have bought the entire mall. They're even going to expand the mall with just a bigger community college. And they partnered with a developer who is now building housing and office in orange, housing in yellow on the parking lots surrounding the mall. And they also have a couple of kind of quads and parks and a jogging trail that goes all the way around it to that new transit station. So really, I think a pretty great, and one of the details that I just love on this one, that the developer partner now requires, I don't know if in every case, but at least in some of the cases, that as part of the lease agreement with anybody who's building the office there, they have to agree to hire a certain number of the interns from the community college, which is a really nice little deal. So, in this case, you're getting re-inhabitation, redevelopment, and regreening, and transit, and you're educating folks for the middle wage, middle skill jobs that we actually really desperately need, and that those folks are eager to get that training. And so that brings me to the next challenge: competing for jobs. So a lot of the suburbs have way more jobs. I mean, over 80% of jobs are more than 3 miles from the central business district in most of all of our, on average throughout the US. And but they sprawl, so they're not as visible as the high rises of downtown. We don't think of necessarily, but the job sprawl is a big deal. And the model, though, really was always the suburban office park or the corporate campus, where it was assumed that research occurred with a scientist having epiphanies, looking out in a single solo room, looking out at a pastoral landscape. Lately, we now know that patents correlate with higher density. And it's thought that innovation really best occurs through chance meetings at the lounge, the workspace, the bar. So there's more urbanism is increasingly really seen as the amenity for office, both because it helps to trigger innovation, presumably, but also because it's just the environment that a lot of the younger workers are looking for. So on the one hand, there's a lot of, there's over 143 office parks in my database now that have announced they're trying to, in some way, urbanize. But then there's also, on the non-corporate side, there's all the smaller retail spaces and some really cool things that's happening, I think, to encourage smaller and local business. So here's one of those big office parks, another Austin project. So this was IBM this was where IBM both designed and manufactured the Selectric typewriter. That was the high tech of its day in the 60s. This is about 12 miles northwest of downtown Austin. The first step was to build some walkable urbanism in this one little stretch, very high-end shops, nicely detailed streets and things. Then they started building more housing, some more sort of mixed use, and it had housing up above the shops. And then they began to occupy parts of, they filled the remaining parts of the old manufacturing, became creative office. They put little liner buildings with bars, and all the hip bars kind of from downtown were now also got a local location here. And it kind of exploded. They're now building another transit stop. This is all, we designated it future, but this is all mostly built out. So, but over here, the diagram on the right shows how the black streets are those existing suburban streets, very wide. Just so here's lower left is a photograph, is what this one here looks like. And so all the parking stuff, the big wide standard office park stuff, that's all, those are the black, the sort of what we would call the B streets. But in between, they built the red A streets, very walkable, much more urban, that fine grain, filled with shops and restaurants and a lot of housing up above. And you know, some people kind of deride, oh, Domain is like living at the mall, but it's an outdoor mall and it's packed with people. And now Amazon, Facebook, Google are all buying up and building kind of 12 and 18-story towers because the urbanism is there. So it's kind of actually revived the office park. It's now bringing in office as the last phase since the urbanism has been established. So let's see. This is a much more simple, modest little office park retrofit. This in 1980, you can sort of see here, there's a shopping mall and some 3-story garden apartment sort of around it, very typical suburban kind of stuff. And then this little 3 office buildings. They gave up the parcels over on the right to a library and a community center. Very typical kind of how we did things. But when the transit line, the Washington, D.C. Metro line was extended and a new stop was added here, the owner of the office park said, wow, my surface parking lots don't make sense. I'm going to tuck those kind of under the hill and get a little parking deck. And he built a new street right in between his office buildings, brought in grocery, a cinema, and a whole lot of housing. Some of it expensive condos, some of it student housing, just a wide mix of housing types. That has since, now the mall is talking about extending the street grid. Several of those 3-story apartment buildings have been replaced with 8-story, a couple 30-story. Transit triggers redevelopment, big time. So on the one hand, as an urbanist, I loved this project. They didn't tear anything down. They just infilled it. I thought, that's so cool. Then I went and visited it, and I took this photo, lower right. And as an architect, I wanted to scream. They hired a strip mall architect to design their Main Street retail. This is designed as if you were going 60 miles an hour past it. Big signs, big simple fonts, nothing to reward the pedestrian eye with touch, texture, the details that I sort of had shown earlier in white Flint. Now, I know it's unsustainable, but quite frankly, I hope it burns down and they get a chance to redesign it, rebuild it, get it right. Because they got the urbanism, they got the bones right, but they really blew it on the architecture. Design matters. And this is the office park that if my students had to end up at an office park, this is the one they'd want to be at. This is Taxi. Just outside of Denver. It's in the River North Rhino district of Denver, still is in Denver, but outside of the downtown. It's a former taxi distribution parking lot and the auto body repair place, all on a very industrial kind of strip. And it's really the anti-corporate creative office that is now, I think, incredibly attractive to a lot of people. The Mickey Zeppelin and his son are the developers. Mickey, at the groundbreaking, he lit an office cubicle on fire. That sort of, he saw that artists were moving into some of these older industrial buildings. He said, I think there's a bigger market than just artists. I think there's all sorts of creative people. And he was absolutely right. So, and he plays to the authenticity, even though now he's built several new buildings and continues to expand the site. There's still some of the striping in the parking lot, even as they've added all the sort of bioswales and various more infiltration. Every new building, as well as the old buildings, has the glass garage door as a sort of homage to because they were still there on the auto body repair place that is still there. And it's a little bit of, I think it's a wink and a nod to, do you want to work in that glass enclosed office building where you'll never get to open a window in a cubicle, or do you want to work here? In addition to work, what he's done though, that is really remarkable, in the other office parks where people have been adding housing, he added housing, but he added family housing, 4-bedroom units. And then he's just built workforce housing where the employer pays a quarter of the rent so that the lowest paid employee can still afford to live on site. And he hired some really good architects, Will Bruder, David Baker, I think, to really do some quite remarkable buildings. So here's some of that family housing. The big amenity at the site is a swimming pool made of shipping containers. The restaurant on the site is a heritage food incubator. It's Moroccan on Mondays and Ethiopian on Tuesday, and just different cuisines. So really breaking that idea of what we think of as the suburban workplace. And let's see, but small business has a really important role too. And the fact is the suburbs have become, really for the last 20 years, more immigrants coming to the US are landing in suburbs than landing in cities. We think of the old Chinatowns as in the cities. That's just not at all, hasn't been true for a very long time now. So a lot of malls are becoming ethnic malls to support these different kind of immigrant communities. This one, Plaza Fiesta in Atlanta, the owners took one of the department store spaces and subdivided it into 140 little kind of 10-foot by 10-foot stalls that are now 140 mostly immigrant entrepreneurs, small businesses. And it's businesses and services. So this is the bus station that will take you in 24 hours down to Monterey, the Spanish-speaking lawyers, Spanish-speaking pharmacies. And they have a lot of just events. They'll bring up a Mexican wrestlers, Mexican pop stars, and whenever the Georgia legislature puts forward an anti-immigrant bill, the rallies start here in this parking lot. So really is, yes, it's still primarily retail, but it's actually also really, these are real community centers for the faces and folks that suburban retail used to just ignore. And this can happen, sort of, there are smaller scale kinds of versions. So here's a strip mall in DeSoto, Texas, where a former Ace Hardware store was about to become a Dollar General, and the mayor talked to a local developer and said, can't we do better? Something that would help people more. So Monty Anderson of Options Real Estate said, well, let's partner. I will turn the space into a business incubator, but you have to provide the mentoring for people who are really trying to start new businesses. So this one is a really great project, and Shoe-esque has really great shoes, and they have a website. Just saying. Not that anyone wears shoes anymore. I don't know. Okay, last topic is the big one, climate change, adding water and energy resilience. There's so much to talk about here, but I think this just image always haunts me. And it could be anywhere. This happens to be Philadelphia, and just looking at what happened to the streams before and after suburbanization. We have, we think of the suburbs again as these leafy green kind of, oh, they must be more ecologically helpful than cities. And in some respects they are, but in a whole lot of respects, they're really pretty terrible. So I wish there were even more examples of energy retrofits. And the word energy retrofit mostly just means putting in a lot more insulation and double pane glass and that kind of thing, which is absolutely a great thing when that happens. But when we hear about really cutting edge solar suburbs, they're all new builds, because it's just so much easier to build new and really do some of the kinds of projects that Harrison Fraker has shown in his books. But nonetheless, there are some of these retrofits that we do see a fair amount of solar, wind, geothermal coming in. We see in a few cases of energy districts with microgrids, some waste to energy, and a lot of actually the reuse of office, a lot of times these office spaces and or manufacturing industrial spaces had pretty robust cooling, heating, and power, or even combined cooling, heating, and power. So there are real opportunities. Whoops, not controlling my screen that well. So the energy, I'm still not finding as many, I think, really great examples of places becoming much significantly decarbonized. But the good news is there's a lot happening with how we're treating water. And because of the water energy nexus, reducing water also reduces energy use significantly. It varies enormously depending on what part of the country you're in and what the sources of energy are, but more or less, we take about a quarter of our energy use is to pump water all the way around and pump and treat water, and about a quarter of our water use is used in the production of energy. So again, get the two, go for the twofer. So a lot of what we need to really be focused on, and I'll show a few examples, are improving water quality, what to do when there's drought, places that are droughts don't have enough water, and what to do in the places where there's flooding and too much water. So let me show the last of the Austin projects. Austin, they're really kicking it on energy. So we had to include more of these. Austin Energy, I haven't seen any. I'd say Minnesota has some of the best water folks on water public agencies, but Austin really on their energy does some great things. And so when the Miller Airport was decommissioned, it became a pretty amazing opportunity for 700 acres of publicly owned land to be redeveloped. And the city, after lots and lots of 10 years of meetings with a very public process, decided they wanted to make a super green, super affordable, equitable, walkable community. And there's a much bigger story here, but what I think is a couple things they're doing that are really cool. They're doing affordability both by design and by subsidy. So they're creating homes on really small lots. So that reduces your land, your water, and your bills, and it kind of gives you more opportunity. You can walk more places. They reduce heat gain by required porches, required street trees, and minimizing the western frontage. And they build all their homes to be solar ready. They've created a solar microgrid for most of the residential, but then the commercial, they have built their own combined cooling and heating and power plant. They've got some really cutting edge battery storage, and they have a UT Austin think tank that is monitoring every single bit of water and energy use. And then they also have this real estate transaction fee that in perpetuity, when any property sells, 0.25% of the sale price goes into a fund that helps to maintain affordability. So it's really quite impressive. And so this photograph is kind of showing homes that are fronting onto a shared green. And then these are alleys. So you have the garages face the other garages. Then you've got some stacked townhouses here, some paseo houses here. You've got really a tremendous variety of housing types, and a whole commercial district anchored by a children's hospital and a number of things. But this was the first thing they built was a strip mall, but it is designed with the parking lots designed as future building sites. It's just that right at the beginning, they still needed some revenue producing features. So that will be converted eventually. And one of the very few examples of residential subdivisions getting retrofitted. I mean, once property has been subdivided into so many small parcels of ownership, it is pretty rare to see many retrofits. But I love this. The Maplewood Living Street, it was a demonstration project that has since led to now a whole policy that every time they're replacing they're repaving the street, they narrow the road and then build both sidewalks and build rain gardens in that space. So you're getting less asphalt, which means less surface area to pick up all the toxins from the streets. You're getting more of that being absorbed by these rain gardens, and really only 10% of that water now is going directly into the sewers. And so they're really helping, be a big help for their water quality, but you're also getting the sidewalks, which now really helps with public health. And another, I think, example now here, one of what to do when there's too much water. So Meriden, Connecticut, working class community, was a lot of industrial. It was called Silver City at one point. They made a lot of the silver, forks and knives. But in the 70s, to compete with the suburbs, they used urban renewal money to build a mall right in their downtown and on top of a creek. The culverts failed consistently, and the whole downtown would flood. It was just such a repeating disaster. They finally got the money to demolish the mall and build a stormwater park. They daylit the creek. There they are, taking out the culverts, putting back the creek. And they designed the park a little like a bathtub. It can now hold, it removed 227 downtown properties out of the floodplain because now all that water is held inside the park. I love stormwater parks, and I'm going to show another one. This one is in Atlanta, where it was done for a different reason, a slightly different reason. Yes, there were creeks that had been culverted and that were failing. But in this case, it was also Atlanta has a combined sewer overflow problem. So the city was about to spend $40 million to just build an underground tank to detain the water during a storm event, until local architect led the fight and said, why are you preserving the parking lot from the damage of this pike? It's just 17 acres of parking lots. Let's make it a park. And so again, they've designed a stormwater park with pretty steep walls. This thing is a bathtub. It does fill up, but I've seen weddings occur here. So it's solving, it's one step towards solving the combined sewer overflow problem. And it creates, it's a remarkable space. It's actually been so successful that the park was really designed in a part of town that had the very low income and had the least amount of access to park space. And it is now there's a lot of displacement going on. And part of that's the park, part of that's because the Beltline is immediately adjacent to the park. And then this old Sears warehouse was converted into Pond City Market, an extremely successful mixed-use project. So all of these things, this area has gentrified enormously, and it is now seen as a real site of green eco-gentrification and green gentrification. That is a very, very real concern. But I still think there's a lot of lessons to be learned simply in terms of just how to handle that stormwater really quite beautifully. And I think this is the last of the water ones. So this is Hassalo on 8th in Portland, Oregon. It's before was, where's my mouse? Okay, so this office building and a big parking lot is the site. It's across the river from downtown Portland. This is the sort of suburban part of Portland where all the big stuff goes, the arena, the big office, 1970s office buildings, and the mall is right almost where this photograph was taken. Today, now, those parking lots have been built up with new housing. And they even, this is an aerial view looking down, they put in a green street and a car street to get it back down to the size of the downtown blocks. What they also, just from an urban perspective, it's really, I think, a lovely project. But what they did in terms of the water is also quite remarkable. So there's just every possible water treatment, roof gardens, rain gardens, green roofs. But they are capturing not only the gray water on site, but also the black water, the toilet water. And they're treating it on site in artificial wetland, constructed wetlands. So this is NORM, the Natural Organic Recycling Water Machine. And it is proudly on display right in the plaza. People have lunch sitting next to it. It is treating sewage on site. Now, is this just because, it's Portland and they're just so eco service? Well, yes, but this was the San Diego developers, pretty hard-nosed guys. They are doing it because they're getting they're saving almost $1.5 million in sewer development charges or impact fees. So these kinds of sustainable features, though, I mean, I love how it really is made absolutely a part of the design very proudly. So my closing slide is just to ask you, I hope what you take away from this talk is the suburbs need you because you have the imagination that is absolutely needed to help people imagine and see change in these places. And while you're doing that with that imagination, I think you've got tremendous opportunities to promote social justice, to solve multiple problems at once, to stop encouraging dependence on cars. Think about that. Every project that you do, are you encouraging people, the only way to get there is by car? Stop. And plant trees instead of tearing them down. We don't need to tear down another tree in this country ever again. If we simply built on top of all the existing parking lots at 2 stories, we would solve our housing crisis for decades. If we actually built some of those even more than 2 stories, I mean, we can solve a whole lot of additional problems.